An hour later, Karen and Tom present themselves once again at Jack Calvin's office. Karen has washed her face and reapplied her makeup. She now feels calm and detached, almost stoic in the face of disaster. She takes comfort in Tom's support, but she's terrified of what happens next. "Come in," Calvin says, brisk and professional. He had rearranged his calendar for this meeting. "There's no chit-chat today. Have a seat." As they said, Karen thinks of how every time she's in this office, things are worse. "What's happened?" Calvin asks, studying each of them intensely. She lifts her eyes to his and says, "Detective Rosbach has asked me to come down to the station this afternoon to answer some questions. I'd like you to be there with me." Calvin looks carefully from her to Tom and back to her again. He says, "Why go at all? You're not obligated to. You're not under arrest." "Maybe I will be soon," Karen says. Jack Calvin doesn't look as surprised as he might have, she thinks. He picks up a yellow legal pad and that same expensive pen she recognizes from her last visit and waits. "Maybe I better start at the beginning," she says, and takes a deep breath and exhales. "I staged my suicide and ran away to escape an abusive husband. I've been living under a new identity." "Okay," Calvin says slowly. "Is that a crime?" "It depends. It's not a crime per se to fake your death, but you may have committed other crimes in doing so. And adopting a false identity is perpetrating a fraud. But let's come back to that later. What was your name before?" "Georgina Trainer." "I was married to Robert Trainer. He's the man they're trying to identify, the one who was killed that night." She glances at Tom for support, but he's watching the lawyer, not looking at her. Now Calvin seems worried. She knows how bad it looks. Tom says, clearly agitated, "As soon as they identify him, they're going to figure it out. They'll see that his wife died. They already know that Karen took on a new identity, that Karen Fairfield isn't who she really is. They've already been to my office to tell me," Tom says. Karen looks at him in shock. Tom already knew. "The detectives know." "You didn't tell me that," she says, but he turns away from her and looks at Calvin. "What matters is what they can prove," Calvin says evenly. He leans forward over his desk. "So tell me what happened that night," he says, "and please remember I have a duty not to lie to the court, so don't tell me anything that will put me in a difficult position." She hesitates. "I don't remember everything yet, but I can tell you what I do remember," she says. She tells Calvin what she told Tom earlier, except she leaves out any mention of the gun. But she tells him everything else, up to when she opened the door of the restaurant. Calvin stares at her, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. An ominous silence fills the office. "Might you have had a gun with you, hypothetically?" "There may have been a gun, hypothetically," she answers carefully. "Is there any way that this hypothetical gun, should it be found, could be traced back to you?" He looks at her closely, concerned. "The gun was purchased illegally and not registered to her. They can't trace it to her if it's found, and there are no fingerprints on it. She's sure of that. She never handled it without gloves. No," she says firmly. Calvin sits back in his chair, which squawks a little, and is quiet, obviously thinking. Then he leans forward again and places both hands on his desk. "Here's what we're going to do," Calvin says. "We're going to see if they come up with enough to charge you. I'm sure they will once they identify him. The circumstantial evidence is strong. It will be enough. But it's another matter to prove it at a trial." "But," Karen blurts out. Calvin looks at her inquiringly. "But what?" I couldn't have killed him, she says firmly. I couldn't have. She repeats, I don't think I'm capable of it. Her lawyer and her husband look at her. Tom quickly glances away, almost as if he's embarrassed, but the lawyer stares at her. Calvin says, who do you think might have killed him? I don't know. Can you take a guess? She glances at Tom and then looks back at the lawyer again. He might have had enemies. What kind of enemies? Business enemies. What kind of business was he in? The lawyer asks. He was an antique dealer, she adds. I'm not sure all of his business dealings were entirely on the up and up, but I knew better than to ask. He knew some shady people. There's a silence in the room that seems to stretch on forever. Karen sits completely still in her chair. The thought of going to trial for murder terrifies her. Sitting in the lawyer's office, she realizes it's too late. I should have run, she thinks. Finally, she says, Detective Rosbach is expecting me at the station. You're not going, Calvin says. When they think they've got enough, then let them come arrest you. Now, tell me more about how you got away from Robert Traynor. She tells him everything about the months of planning, how she squirreled money away, all the while secretly visiting a women's shelter for support, and finally what she did that day at the Hoover Dam Bypass Bridge. She adds in a dull voice, in a way it was easy because I had no family to leave behind. My parents were dead, I had no siblings. We had no life insurance policy on me, so I knew the insurance companies wouldn't be looking into it. I thought I could pull it off, and I was desperate. I didn't think I had anything to lose. When she's finished, there's a long silence. Then Calvin asks, what did you do with the pack? Oh, yes, that. She pauses, remembering. I had to get rid of it, but I couldn't just toss it out the window. Everything in it could be traced back to me. So I added some heavy rocks to it and dropped it off a bridge into a lake in the middle of the night. Tom looks at her as she says this and then averts his eyes, as if he can't bear to imagine her doing it. I know it makes me seem cold-blooded, Karen says, eyeing each of them almost defiantly, but what would you have done in my place? When neither man answers, she says, right, you would never be in my place. How wonderful for you. How easy it must be to be a man. Tom shoots her a conciliatory look, as if he personally wants to make up for every lousy male on the planet. She says to him, I kept thinking I would tell you at some point. She asks him now, ignoring the lawyer, as if he weren't even in the room. What should I have told you, right at the beginning? What would you do with a woman who'd run away from her life and had a fake ID? Later on, you would have felt hurt, lied to, like you do now. The truth is, there was never a good time to tell you. She's almost matter of fact. She isn't exactly apologizing. She did what she had to do, and this is the result. Tom squeezes her hand, but he isn't looking at her. He's looking down at her hand in his. Oh!